Well, thank you all for coming and welcome to the speaker series or lecture series for the School of Language, Culture and Race. I think this is our first one that we've had face-to-face for a while, at least for those of you who are here. We're happy to be back to some sense of normalcy. Let me just give you a little introduction to the lecture series itself, and then I'll introduce our speakers. The lecture series was created to connect faculty in the School of Languages, Cultures, and Race with faculty and other academic units on campus who are doing research on similar topics, but from their respective disciplines. The idea is to put their works in conversation with each other and to highlight scholarly connections and research convergences. The lecture series is premised on interdisciplinarity and on transdisciplinary exchanges, cooperation, and collaboration. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We will hold questions until after each have finished their presentation. Matthew Avery Sutton is the Berry Family Distinguished Professor in the Liberal Arts and the Chair of the Department of History at Washington State University. His most recent book is Double Crossed: The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. He is also author of American Apocalypse: A History of Modern Evangelicalism, and Amy Semple McPherson and the Resurrection of Christian America. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Republic. In 2016, he was appointed a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow. Carmen R. Lugo-Lugo is a professor of comparative ethnic studies and American studies and culture and the director of the School of Languages, Culture, and Race. Her most recent book is Feminism After 9/11, Women's Bodies as Cultural and Political Threat, co-authored with Mary Kay Bloodsworth. Mary and Carmen have also co-authored Projecting 9/11, Gender, Race, and Citizenship in Recent Hollywood Films, and Containing Un-American Bodies, Race, Sexuality, and Post-11 September 2001 Constructions of Citizenship. Her research focuses on representation of Latinx groups in U.S. culture and society and on cultural productions of 9/11. We'll begin today's lecture with Carmen. Oh, I forgot to tell them.
Okay, I'm gonna take, since I'm far away from everybody, I'm gonna take my mask off. Put it here. So thank you all for coming. And I also would like to thank Matt for graciously agreeing to do this with me today. What I'm presenting today is a think piece rather than a research paper, and I welcome any and all feedback on it. I want to open the presentation with a quote by Linda Martin Alcoff, and she says, "Identities are embodied horizons from which we each must confront and negotiate our shared world and specific life conditions." It's one of my favorite quotes on identities. Now I would like to establish the main difference between identities or identity categories, which I will refer to as identities here, and labels or social markers, which I will refer to as labels, especially as these concepts apply and are applied to individuals. On the one hand, identities are exclusively about an individual's sense of self. That is how a person sees themselves and organizes their own reality. On the other hand, labels involve how an individual is perceived and classified by others. One connection between identities and labels is that they're all based on agreed upon social understandings and narratives, including meanings, ideas, and symbols. They're also deployed through those very social understandings and narratives. These narratives become an epistemic well of sorts. Think, for instance, of the epistemic well of ideas about Latinx cultures and peoples, including immigration and citizenship status, size of families, the jobs they perform, level of attractiveness, etc., all of which have been crafted and developed within US culture. However, although identities and labels draw from the same epistemic well to articulate meanings, they should be understood as different phenomena, as the one deals with understandings of the self and the second with understandings of others. Of course, there can be overlap between a person's sense of self and how that person is seen, understood, and treated by others, or labeled by others. This is especially relevant for certain identities and labels that are evident on the body, what Linda Martin Alcoff calls visible identities. In her words, the reality of identities often comes from the fact that they're visibly marked on the body itself, guiding, if not determining, the way we perceive and judge others and are perceived and judged by them. Also, although we all draw from the same epistemic well to create our identities and articulate the labels that we use for or against others, each identity and label is articulated through myriad of understandings, so we may not always draw the exact same features from the well to create our identities or to deploy labels. Thus, although my understanding of myself as a woman is my own understanding, it is still based on how society constructs the category woman itself and whatever characteristics I deem appropriate. That understanding is bound to be different from the way others may see me as a woman if they do. For instance, for some, the fact that I am in a same-sex marriage and have never been pregnant, given birth, or mothered a child renders at least a level of my womanhood suspect, for they equate being a woman with heterosexual coupling and the ability and willingness to procreate or mother another human. The fact that labels are at the mercy of and oftentimes informed by perceptions complicates matters, as perceptions are tricky, to say the least. On the one hand, perceptions rely on the most blatant stereotypical features included in the epistemic well. On the other hand, people are driven by what they perceive to be real when deploying understandings of socially meaningful labels like race, gender, social class, sexuality, ability or disability, age, citizenship status, etc. They look at, process, understand, and perhaps most importantly, treat others, sometimes based exclusively on perceptions, which is the reason labels are so important. They lead to treatment. Because in many instances, identities and labels overlap, we tend to assume that it is our identities, the ones that lead to our experiences or the treatment we receive from others. However, person A treats person B based on their own understanding of who person B is. Sometimes that understanding squares with how person B understands herself, leading person B to believe that they were treated in a certain way because of their own self-understanding. For instance, and going back to me being a woman, regardless of my sexuality and childless status, after 50 years of constituting myself as a woman, I am quite skilled at performing and embodying femininity, the quintessential marker of a woman in our society. As a result, most people treat me as a woman with all that entails because they perceive me as such. But, and this point must be made clear, this treatment is not about me seeing myself as a woman, but about them seeing me as such. Because whatever treatment I receive by others is not about who I think I am, but about who they think I am. The same with my ethnic identity. I see myself as a Puerto Rican and sometimes claim the label Latina. But whether others see me as a Latina or a Puerto Rican is up to their understandings of those categories. Of course, there is no denying the close connection between certain identity categories and their evident marks on the body. And oftentimes, it is those evident marks on the body and how they are read and perceived by others that leads to treatment. This confusion between what identities are and what labels do is the reason so many double down on identity as a lived experience. We tend to make a direct connection between identity and experience, bypassing labels, when people deploying labels on or against us are the ones who force us to live particular experiences. A quick illustration. I remember a good friend of mine who identifies as a Catholic Puerto Rican man telling me that immediately after September 11, 2001, he had people yelling at him on the streets where he lived in Washington, D.C., calling him a Muslim terrorist. He looked Muslim or Middle Easterner to them, and that was all that mattered, for that was how he was treated. His identity as a Catholic-raised Puerto Rican man was not able to do anything to stop, change, or ameliorate the impact of the verbal assault he experienced as a result of other people's perceptions of him, and the labels and anger those perceptions conjured in their minds. The misreading of my friend's ethnic, racial, and religious background illustrates how labels, through the experiences they generate, can have an enormous impact on individuals and how those individuals live their lives. The discrepancies between first-person and third-person perspectives are everything here. And in many cases, including this one, the discrepancy is not just about the misreading of a person's background, but about the violent judgment that the misreading carried and the terrifying experience that a person was forced to have as a result. In this particular case, my friend decided never to correct those belligerent xenophobic individuals on the streets. As shaken up as he was, he decided to never cater to the "but I'm not a Muslim" way of responding to misidentifications like this, because he understood quite well that ultimately the fact that he wasn't a Muslim was not the issue. The fact that our government created a rhetoric that allowed for this hunting of Muslims on the streets, and the fact that those people wanted an easy target to let out their venom was. Of course, in and of themselves, misreadings are not all traumatizing, violent, or life-threatening. Some can just be annoying, and some can even be humorous. But the point is that they all engage our time and have elements that shape our lives. The point is that sometimes perceptions are everything. So back to identities now. Identities to an extent are also informed by perceptions of the self in this case. Alcoff is also helpful here when she says, accepting identities is tantamount to accepting and performing the dominant scripts power has invented. Identities are not and can never be accurate representations of the real self, and thus interpolation, always in a strict sense, fails in its representational claim, even while it succeeds in inciting and disciplining one's practice. Anthony Appiah also talks about scripts when describing identities as narratives that people can use in shaping their life plans and in telling their life stories. Thus, although identities are highly personal constructions, as dominant social scripts or narratives, they still are socially articulated and thus must make sense to others. And this is when notions of authenticity come into play. And as Appiah reminds us, because the ethics of authenticity requires us to express what we centrally are, they further demand recognition in social life. Authenticity brings disciplining into play, as described by Alcoff, an unpleasant process experienced by those who improvise, ad-lib, or move too far away from the dominant scripts. As we operate within these sanctioned scripts and narratives, then identities must be based, and more importantly, must be grounded and rooted on something tangible. Socially, we have created specific criteria to ground or root identities, mainly ancestry or genealogy, culture, experience, history, or a combination of these. It is through these sanctioned criteria that others perceive our identities as real, authentic, or accurate. We're just not allowed to pick identities willy-nilly at least not without some sort of repercussion, often in the form of social chastising, a rather brutal form of disciplining. These sanctioned criteria create a connection to the individuals who have come before and the groups they belong to, who in many instances and against many odds struggled to stay alive. That is why a white, blonde, blue-eyed woman of white parents who sues a historically Black college on the East Coast, claiming that they discriminated against her because she's white, would have a difficult time if she suddenly claimed to be Black. She could, let's say, move 3,000 miles away from that historically Black college and reinvent herself as Black by tanning herself something fierce and teasing her hair. But if found out, she would have a lot of explaining to do because her claim is not supported by ancestry, culture, or history, not even her own personal history or experience before she decided to recreate herself. That is to say, her claim does not fit any sanctioned script. But identities have also proven to be tricky, even when supported or based on any of the tangible elements listed earlier, and even when the scripts are sanctioned and motives aren't in question. Ethnic and racial identities, for instance, are usually based or grounded on ancestry, cultural background, phenotype, and history, but there are plenty of exceptions pointing to people who can claim many or all those elements belonging to one group and still not identify as a member of that group. I offer as an example here comedian Louis C.K., who in his special 2017 made what he thought was a joke about his ancestry. Mainly when discussing how disgusting his father's penis looked to him as a child. He says, "My father who's Mexican." He then looks at the audience and says, "My father is Mexican. I am not. Just because my father fucked my mother for a number of years doesn't make me Mexican. It makes my mother a whore." The misogynistic ending has as many racialized connotations as the rest of the joke. But my focus here is on CK's claim that although his father is Mexican, he is not. An interesting claim given that up to the age of 7, CK was raised in Mexico and Spanish was the only language he knew how to speak. I'm not saying that CK should feel, identify, or even be perceived as Mexican. What I'm saying is that ethnic and racialized identities, like many other identities, can be difficult to tease out and the result of personal choices. And it is conceivable for someone else with that exact same set of circumstances to actually identify as Mexican and not call his mother a whore. So when I say that all identities are chosen, I don't mean that we choose how we're seen or how we're treated, only that we choose how we view ourselves and how we identify ourselves in relation to others. I also do not mean that there is a free-for-all where everyone chooses whatever identity they please, or a buffet type of spread offering equally relevant identities from which to select our preferences. Even if that were the case, that is, even if any and all identities were available to me, it would be very difficult for me to pick an identity that isn't relevant to what Alcott calls my life experience and make it fit. As I explained earlier, identities must make sense to both those using the identities and to those around them. Identities must be legible. Also, some identities are chosen more actively or affirmatively, as some identities are more evident to ourselves and to those around us than others. The most difficult aspect involving identities is that, as I explained earlier, although we are the ones doing the choosing, we're also at the mercy of others' interpretations of how we look, sound, or appear to them. That is to say, we're at the mercy of identity disciplining by both those who belong to the identities that we're choosing as our own and by those who don't. What TERFs are doing to trans women is an example of the former, and someone who's not Latinx telling someone who identifies as Latino, you don't look Latino, or worse yet, you're not Latino, is an example of the latter. This is why in the end, even though identities are personal matters, they're still social phenomena easier to handle by others when they're rooted in something that makes sense to them. When identities are mapped on the body, follow history or experience, and abide by strict social constructions, that is when they follow the dominant scripts. They are at the peak of legibility. And this is why some identities will be challenged, contested, and discarded by others. Here's a silly example. Although I could choose to identify as a dinosaur or a Martian, science through DNA, history through my genealogy and that of humans, and those close to me through their obstinacy will tell you that I am neither a dinosaur nor a Martian, and that I have never before today identified as such. And there is nothing evident on my body that tells others that I embody the images of dinosaurs that science has recreated for them, or the figures of Martians that they have individually and collectively imagined. A less silly example. I do sometimes, like I said earlier, claim to be Latina. The fact that I was born and raised in Puerto Rico of Puerto Rican ancestry dating back to at least 4 generations would automatically support my claim to being Latina, insofar as Puerto Ricans are considered part of the Latinx group. So there it is, personal history, genealogy, group history. But what exactly is it that I'm claiming when I say that I am Latina? What ideas or forms of knowledge from the Latinx epistemic well and dominant scripts about Latinx people am I imposing on my body, on myself? Me, a colonized subject from a colonized people on a colonized island. And what does it mean that instead of the festive or insulting features found in the Latinx epistemic well or Latinx dominant scripts, I decide to draw colonialism first? Going back to dinosaurs and Martians, to which, as already stipulated, I have no actual measurable, tangible connection, the question, of course, is, should I have the right or the space to identify as a dinosaur and or a Martian, should I choose to? I don't have an answer to that question, but I do have a few follow-up questions that may guide our understanding. What would the purpose of me doing this be? Is it sheer nihilism? Is it a suggestion that I can be whatever I want? Do these identifications make me happy or give me purpose? Or is it perhaps about challenging the very rigidity of identities and labels? Also, and perhaps more importantly, would the answers to these questions be different if applied to my claim of being Latina? A simple answer is yes, 2 of those identities are debatable, 1 isn't. But is it really that simple? This last question brings me to the final point I want to make. The fact that some identities, whether evident on the body or not, are inherited, so to speak, and carry with them the baggage of history and social practices, which have affected generations of people within the groups those identities represent. The irony that identities carry with them becomes their most poignant aspect. The fact that although individuals are the ones who embrace them for themselves, identities only become relevant when used by a person in relation to those around him, her, or them. That is, if I were the only person left on the planet, I wouldn't have to worry about identifying as anything, let alone a dinosaur, a Martian, or a Latina. My identities wouldn't matter at all. Moreover, it is those around us, those to whom we're disclosing our identities and the ones we're identifying ourselves in relation to, the same ones who end up validating or challenging them. And here's where the baggage of history and social practices comes in. Just ask the white, blonde, blue-eyed woman with the overly done tan and the teased hair who sued the historically Black college for discriminating against her whiteness and who now chooses to identify as Black. I'm not saying that she should be allowed without challenge to identify as Black, quite the contrary. The thing is, though, that she was indeed able to successfully identify as Black, the ultimate visible identity, for years. It wasn't until her own family decided to claim that she wasn't Black that her identity was first questioned, then invalidated, and finally discredited in the eyes of many. The woman became a stranger to repurpose the concept developed by Sarah Ahmed. For Ahmed, the stranger is produced as a category within knowledge rather than coming into being in an absence of knowledge. In this case, the episteme embedded within Black bodies and the heavy history they carry with them. So yes, all identities are chosen. And although they embody horizons, as Alkov tells us in the quote I read at the beginning, for better or worse, the particular identities we choose matter in knowledge. They matter in history. They matter in inheritance. And choosing identities comes with repercussions, which is to say, the act of claiming an identity carries consequences. Thank you.
Something is screwy here. 1 second. Can't get to the bottom line. There we go. Got it. Okay, perfect. I'll follow Carmen's lead and take off my mask so that you all can hear me. And I'm assuming that this is about the right place to be in the camera. If not, just send a message in the text and Tom can correct me or move me. Thank you also all for coming. Thank you, Carmen, for inviting me to do this. I was really excited to have this invitation. I'm even gladder to follow Carmen because I have all kinds of questions for your paper now. And so I'm going to try and stick with what I planned, even though I'm already rethinking some of what it is. Let me begin by apologizing about this title. I realized when I put it on the PowerPoint, it is the longest title I've ever used for anything, and it's clearly too long. So I should have had somebody correct me on that. But religious identity matters, but not as much as I used to think. Trump, race, gender, and the long history of evangelical politics. Like many of us, the ascension of Donald Trump to the White House has really shaken a lot of what I thought about American politics, about American culture, about the American people. And it's forced me to rethink not just kind of generic ideas as a layperson, but even to rethink some of my scholarship and some of the assumptions that are built into my scholarship and the ways in which there were things that I missed and things that I need to kind of think through further, and hopefully we can think through together. So let me begin by saying I grew up in an evangelical house. My parents are evangelicals. They still attend an evangelical church. They have voted Republican, I think, for my entire life. So when 2016 came around and I was talking to them about the election, talking to them about the campaign, I asked them who they were going to vote for. And both of them told me they were not voting for Trump. My mother voted for Hillary Clinton. My father voted for, I believe, the Libertarian, although he voted for Biden this last time. What that told me at the time was that evangelicals got it. They could see through Trump, that after 20 or 30 years of building what we now know as the religious right, they would recognize that Trump was a con man, Trump was not one of them, Trump was simply trying to use them for the sake of power, and that would be the end of the story. We all know, though, that that is not where the story ended. That, in fact, Trump got 81% of the white evangelical vote, more of the vote than George W. Bush, or Mitt Romney, or John McCain. And so, and he also, as you can see, got more of the white Catholic vote as well, but that's a story for another day. So this really challenged me. Partly it made me realize how far away I am from the lived lives of the people I study. The longer I'm in academia, the more removed I am. But also, even my own family, who's still very much immersed in that world, was not part of this 81%. So it caught me by surprise. So my goal today is to talk a little bit about the history of fundamentalists and evangelicals in politics, to talk about historiography, the study of those groups, then to talk about my work and how Donald Trump is forcing me to rethink religious identity and religious identity's intersection with race, class, gender, and sexuality. Okay, so to start, we'll start with the rise of American fundamentalism. And some of you may know this story, but the fundamentalist movement really emerged as a movement in the 1920s. And it was created by a group of Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and other independents. There were people in established churches. They were part of established denominations, established churches, but they were building this informal network. And there were a handful of things that tied them together. One was a series of books that were published in 1910 through 1915 called The Fundamentals, and it's pictured here. These were paid for by a wealthy oil man who believed that Protestant Americans had lost their way. And so what he wanted them to do was to return to the fundamentals of the faith. And so he brought together this group of conservative leaders in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain to identify, to articulate what are the fundamentals of the faith. And then they published them in these books. The books were sent out free of charge to every pastor, missionary leader, Sunday school teacher, Bible college professor in the United States. And we think just white. As far as we can tell from the records, they probably just went to all white leaders. I don't think they went to any African-American leaders, but we don't know that for sure. At the same time, this group of Protestants were organizing Bible conferences where they would come together, usually on an annual basis, and talk about the Bible, talk about prophecy, talk about where they thought the state of humankind was at. They began setting up Bible colleges. They believed that time was running short, that the world was going to end pretty soon, and so it was important to evangelize as rapidly as possible. And so to do that, you don't need a liberal arts education. You just need to learn how to read your Bible, how to explain your Bible, how to attract attention. So they would have, they would have classes on Bible skits or on music, the kinds of things you could do to draw a crowd to then try and convert them. They also were excellent at using technology. They set up radio stations all over the country. And they established a number of magazines. And so all these things were non-denominational, right? They weren't the monopoly by the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Methodists, but they were a product of all of these groups together. Now, in 1919, they began to think about a name to call themselves. And one smart journalist who was part of this network said, you know what, we should call ourselves fundamentalists, as those who are willing to, quote, do battle royale for the fundamentals of the faith. And so that's where the name came from. That's what it stuck. So anytime you hear anybody refer to a fundamentalist Muslim or a fundamentalist Jew, fundamentalist Christian, it comes from this guy in 1919 saying, we're going to do battle royale for the fundamentals. I should also mention these were almost entirely white folks. Theologically, there were a lot of African Americans, Latinos in the US, who would have agreed to or ascribed to the doctrines here, but they were intentionally segregated from the movement. They just were not invited, they weren't included. The Bible conferences often happened in segregated Jim Crow hotels. So it's very much a white-oriented movement, explicitly white. The term fundamentalist itself became problematic throughout the 1930s. Reporters began to use it in a derogatory sense. And so the self-identified fundamentalists realized they needed to rebrand. And so during World War II, they resuscitated an older, more historic term, the term evangelical. And this is young Billy Graham here in the late 40s or early 1950s. They decided they would call themselves evangelicals to get away from the kind of pejorative sense of the term fundamentalist. Again, it was entirely white. It was a network. It was best represented through the rise of a lobby called the National Association of Evangelicals, which today is still the largest evangelical lobby in the country. It doesn't get a lot of media attention because they're relatively careful about what they do. They try not to be explicitly partisan. They're most interested in lobbying the government for access to, it used to be radio, but then later for television, for internet. They're interested in human rights issues for missionaries, especially so they can get their missionaries abroad. They're also very interested in chaplains. They want to make sure they have their people in the military. And so they're very much involved and engaged in government, but it's on things we think of as less partisan than what we associate with the religious right. They were also explicitly and exclusively white. They too didn't make whiteness anything they spoke or they articulated explicitly, but again, it was clear they only invited white folks to be part of this network, and they continued to hold their meetings in segregated hotels whenever they were in the South. In the 60s, African-American evangelicals ended up forming their own Black Evangelical Association, which further kind of highlights the whiteness of this particular group. Okay, now where were the historians in all this? For the most part, they were ignoring these folks. So the historians of the 1950s and 60s in the US had a number of assumptions. One of them was what we now call the secularization thesis. They believed that as nations became more modern, as the globe shrunk, as technology improved, religion would die out. That religion was primitive, that people would realize that they just didn't need it anymore. And so that was part of why they didn't take religion all that seriously at all. And they also thought, even if they did take it seriously, it was something that was not going to last. Those historians who did focus on fundamentalists and evangelicals saw them as paranoid, as anti-intellectual, as marginal, as kind of fringe characters who didn't deserve to be really taken that seriously. So they would talk about Billy Graham, they would profile Billy Graham, but they essentially thought he was part of this like dying movement, mostly Southern, mostly rural, mostly kind of country bumpkins. Till 1976. This is one of the major turning points. Newsweek did a cover story. You can see Born Again, the Evangelicals. The inside title of the story is The Year of the Evangelicals. So Newsweek called 1976 that. And what was happening in 1976 that made this relevant? Somebody out here must know. Yes, 76. Tom.
Jimmy Carter ran for president.
Jimmy Carter runs for president, claims to be born again. Gerald Ford is the Republican nominee, claims to be born again. Both of these people, so for the first time, we had two presidential candidates who both didn't just say they were Christian or Protestant in kind of the generic sense that many American presidents have been, but they actually said they were born again. They had this individual experience with Jesus Christ, that he was their personal savior, that they could essentially feel him in their lives. And so journalists went wild trying to make sense of this phenomenon, trying to understand it, trying to study it. And so between 1976 and the early 80s, there's this slew of journalistic reports on this movement. And as usual, the historians kind of follow after the journalists. So historians then began to ask the same questions and try to understand this larger phenomenon of what it meant to be born again, what it meant to be evangelical. And I should also say at this point, evangelicals were political, but they were nonpartisan. You could not identify evangelicals with either political party. If you were an evangelical in the South, you probably voted Democrat, white evangelical in the South. If you were a white evangelical in the North or the West, you probably voted Republican in the 1970s. That, of course, then takes us to 79 and 80, when there's a civil war within the Republican Party between the moderates and the conservatives. The conservatives have been trying to take over the party for a generation, really since the early 60s, but they hadn't really succeeded yet. And they were reading the same articles everybody else was reading, and they saw that evangelicals were growing in power and influence. Their churches were expanding. They were having a larger and larger influence. And they also realized that the evangelicals had never been organized along partisan lines. And so the new right operatives within the Republican Party reached out to Jerry Falwell and to other important leaders of the evangelical movement and recruited them to try to link Republican policy priorities with evangelical social views. And as we know today, he was incredibly successful. They were incredibly successful at doing this. And so 1980, there was still a large number of self-identified evangelicals who voted for Jimmy Carter. But Ronald Reagan really began to cut into that. By 1984, it was pretty clear that evangelicals were moving very rapidly to the Republican Party, to the political right. So it's in this context that historians start writing more serious works on the history of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. So this book came out in 1980 by George Marsden, Fundamentalism in American Culture. I was an undergraduate. A cousin had bought me a gift card to a Bible bookstore. They mostly don't exist anymore, but there used to be these independent bookstores of Christian stuff. And I was getting far enough away from evangelicalism. I didn't want some kind of silly self-help evangelical book or, cross for my necklace. But I did know I liked history. And this book was published by Oxford University Press. And I had no idea what it was, but I thought this looks interesting. And so my purchase of that book in the early 90s had a major influence on my career. But it was an important book for historians. Marsden went on to win the Bancroft Prize, one of the most prestigious prizes a historian can win. He taught history for many years at Duke and then went to Notre Dame for an endowed chair. 1983, Nathan Hatch published this book, Democratization of American Christianity. He also taught at Notre Dame, went on to become the provost of Notre Dame, and then the president of Wake Forest University. So not exactly a lightweight. This book also won many awards, and it looked at evangelicals in the early republic and really argued that if we want to understand the expansion of democracy in the early United States, we have to put religion at the center of that story. And I didn't know what book to pick for Mark Newell, because he's published a ton of books. But he was the other one writing in the 1980s about evangelicals. This is one of his most important books, America's God. When Marston retired from Notre Dame, he went on to Notre Dame for the endowed chair. And he was awarded a National Humanities Medal from George W. Bush. What ties all these books together is that all three of these guys are evangelicals. They all identify as evangelicals, and they're all alive today still. They're all retired. But, and what they did was they didn't like Jerry Falwell. They didn't like the religious right. And so what they wanted to do was write these redemptive stories that present evangelicals in the best positive light. So they took evangelical ideas seriously, evangelical theology seriously. They mostly avoided politics unless it was stuff that we would see as positive or good politics, like abolition or women's rights. They would talk about where evangelicals did those kinds of things. And in some ways, they were trying to present an alternative to Jerry Falwell and to the religious right. But in doing that, they really ignored the centrality of race and racism in the movement, the centrality of gender hierarchies and sexism in the movement, the centrality of nativism and xenophobia in the movement. I mean, you can read their books, and they just don't talk about those issues. The maleness of evangelicalism and the whiteness of evangelicalism are never spoken, right? It's as if evangelicals are evangelicals, but when you actually read the books, they're talking about white and male, with a few minor exceptions. So I go to grad school in the early 2000s, reading all these books. George W. Bush is elected in 2000 as I'm thinking about a dissertation topic. And I realize we need to take evangelical politics seriously, and that these guys have not done it well enough, that there's an opportunity here to do something different. And so my dissertation, what became my first book, was Amy Semple McPherson, The Resurrection of Christian America. She was an evangelist in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. Gender and gender performance was central to my analysis of McPherson, as was sexuality, because there were a number of questions. And I had read Judith Butler in grad school and became enamored with gender performance theory. And it was just, it fascinated me. I don't know if it fascinated my readers, but to see how McPherson kind of played on different gender types and tropes to maintain her power. And so sometimes she could be kind of the Victorian 19th century innocent who needs men to come in and rescue her. And other times she could be the feminist trailblazer who was going to lead more women into equality. And she would use these very consciously, use these identities in different ways. Race was also important to how I told this story because she was in Los Angeles. There was a large Latino population, large African-American population, and she recognized the way race played out in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. And her record was not, I was going to say perfect, that's the wrong word. She was more progressive than a lot of people of her generation, but she also still saw people in very racialized categories and kind of inferiority, superiority. Class was also more important to my analysis than previous folks who had worked on these topics. I was able to find 10,000 index cards that laid out the membership records of her church in Los Angeles. She had this huge church. And the membership records had addresses, occupations, racial categories, how people self-identified in the 1920s and 30s, and addresses. And so I was able to kind of put together a composite of who the people were who were going to her church. But she was also a celebrity. She also had Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin and others would come to her church on occasion. Then in 2014, I published my next big book, American Apocalypse, A History of Modern Evangelicalism. Was still wrestling with this question of evangelical politics and nativism and nationalism and identity, and especially race, because I really wanted to problematize the ways in which we had talked about evangelicals without always qualifying it as white evangelicals. And so just about every chapter in the book, I juxtapose what the white evangelicals are doing with what African Americans are doing who hold to the same assumptions. And those sections are much smaller. partly because the source base was much smaller. It's very difficult to get at African-American church sources from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, which is the bulk of this book. But what I was trying to do was to demonstrate that we need to understand religious identity along with the racial identity, the gender identity, the sexual identity, the nationalist identity, and sexuality. Most recently, and I'm sorry to take you kind of through this quick tour of my CV, but I promise it matters in a second for what I'm going to say. But most recently, Double Cross. This was a different kind of book. It didn't just look at evangelicals and fundamentalists. It also looked at more liberal Protestants, looked at Jews, at American Catholics, and their relationship with Islam. But here is where I looked also at colonization, decolonization, and the ways in which American religious actors, in this case missionaries, who were sent abroad, who then got pulled into World War II, understood these kind of larger issues and what it meant for them to be both an American and a Christian or a Jew, whether Protestant or Catholic. So all of that is to say, I've spent my entire career trying to do two things: trying to convince historians of religion to take gender, race, class, sexuality more seriously than they do. And it really is shocking when you still see, especially people that come out of religious studies departments, and I don't mean to trash an entire discipline, but how often they don't pay enough attention to historical context. They just write about religious studies theory as if it can be removed from and extracted from social historical context. And so one of my target audiences has been those folks to say, you all need to take more than religion seriously. You also need to understand these other categories of identity. The flip side, though, and I'm still committed to this, which is convincing historians who generally don't care at all about religion, that religious identity matters too. That if we think about how people act, what they believe, how they structure their lives, how they're organizing themselves, that their religion matters along with their race and their class and their gender and their sexuality. So I'm working on a new book now, slower than I would like to be working on it, but it's a big history of American Christianity from colonial times to the present. And really what I'm trying to explain in this book is why Americans are far more Christian than almost every other leading nation in the world, and how Americans' Christianity has shaped their politics, their culture, their foreign policy, and their sense of who they are as a people, their nationalism, on and on and on. So I'm going to read you just one paragraph from my draft introduction where I write, "The worlds that American Christians shaped demonstrate that understanding religion is essential to understanding our past. Despite the majority of Americans' commitment to Christianity, we're still at about 70% of Americans identify as Christian. Too often, historians fail to take seriously the significance of religion in defining people's lives. Some scholars treat religious commitments as spurious, arguing that they cloak other interests. In so doing, they ignore what people tell pollsters matter to them, or where they spend their Sundays, or what they do with their money. Nevertheless, religious beliefs often define individuals' relationships, condition their analyses of politics, influence their views of the economy, inform their voting priorities and patterns, determine their perspectives on social issues, influence the curriculum they want their children studying, and help frame how people understand natural disasters, geopolitical change, and war." But then the next paragraph goes on to say that we cannot understand their religious identities without understanding their race, class, gender, sexuality, and then I have in there what scholars call intersectionality, not intersectionality, intersectionality. And so I'm trying to kind of hold these different identities in tension and explain how they all work together. But that takes us back, and this is where I'll conclude, to Donald Trump. This is a prayer meeting at the White House and a dinner. The leaders of the religious right were all here. Jerry Falwell Jr., Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, Ralph Reed, the longtime organizer of the Christian Coalition, James Dobson, who had been very involved in evangelical family politics for many generations. And the problem I'm having is that I still don't quite know how to make sense of this. That the theology I constructed for evangelicals and the stories I told in 2007 and 2014 in those books helped me make sense of why evangelicals would support a George W. Bush or a Mitt Romney or a John McCain. They didn't prepare me to explain why evangelicals will support a Donald Trump. And in fact, it looks like evangelicals, white evangelicals, voted for Donald Trump in even higher numbers in 2020 than they did in 2016. I have some theories. When I give talks, people invite me to come talk about Trump and evangelicals. I'll explain why they like him, why they support him. But when I'm being honest, when I'm sort of admitting what I really think, what the conclusion I'm coming to is that religion matters less than I used to think it did. That the folks who voted for Donald Trump, clearly their race and their gender, their fear of immigrants, their class anxiety, that all of these kinds of things seem to have dictated their voting patterns more than did their religious identity. Because if it was just their religious identity, not just, but if it was primarily their religious identity, they probably would have done what my parents did and voted for Hillary Clinton or the Libertarian or just sat out the 2016 election. But they didn't. We know they didn't. So with that, the further I get in my career, the more confused I get and the fewer answers I have. I'm sorry to say that with the dean sitting in the back, but it's the truth. So thank you.
Questions, comments, concerns? Dean Butler.
Yes, I know, I didn't want to be that guy. But I'll take your invitations to thought pieces just to give you a topic. It's not really in some ways even a question, although there are two sides of the same coin. For Carmen, I'm curious what all this conversation of identity, how it maps onto adolescence. At a time, and maybe it's because I have a 14-year-old or an 11-year-old who is.
So you did say adolescence.
Adolescence, yes. So that, a time when someone is trying on, we talk about trying on new identities and the kind of instability of that, but also a time when you become self-conscious of the identities that other people are putting on you. And the flip side, maybe the word I from Matt, I don't know if this is the right word, the stickiness of identity. What you're asking is, why couldn't people leave? And part of your answer is really historical, the long, what one would have to do to abandon at a kind of any individual inflection point, an election, a choice. So at one point, the kind of, how does all the things you had to say about identity map on, I'm just curious, to adolescence? And then the flip side of that is, when we're stuck in our accreted individual understandings of self, what does it cost to leave when we're not adolescent at some point? Because adolescents can't vote.
I think that one of the interesting things about identities that I didn't actually talk about here is the assumption that we have that they're so permanent, or that they're so heavy, on us. And one of the things that I was trying to do there is make an argument that they really aren't. When I was 14, I was the straightest girl that could be, that you could find. But it wasn't really because that's who I really was. That was, what was given to me. And I kind of cater it to my 14-year-old body. But at the end of the day, and they become heavy because we make them heavy, right? So at some point I had to acknowledge to myself that I wasn't straight. And and that was a really huge process. And I think it's made heavy by what I was talking about in the paper. It's that, the interactions that we have. And because it's not just about my identity, but about how that identity is received by everybody else, right? That's what really is at stake. So I think that, the thing with adolescents is that children do too. They learn how heavy those identities are and how permanent they're supposed to be. And we see what they do to people, right, who are not able to kind of reorient themselves in a way, right, in relation to other identities. I don't know if that answers your question.
There wasn't really a question. I was just curious what you make of it. But I do think it's heavy.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of, I need to find my identity.
Yeah.
Like, it's a thing that I need to figure out who I am. thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have the same feelings with a 15-year-old, but also thinking about how how I separated from my right-wing parents, my evangelical parents, and they're very supportive of my career, but I published something a couple of weeks ago after the Texas abortion law, and I haven't spoken with my parents about it. They usually read and comment on most of what I publish, but that's a topic I just didn't want to discuss with them. Because it is a separation and my identity is different from theirs. But I think for me, Todd, your question is great because it is a question of can you leave and what does it mean to leave and what are the costs, which really demonstrates the way evangelicalism has become the religious right and the religious right has become evangelicalism. That in the 70s, you could vote for Ford or you could vote for Carter and you didn't have a problem with your fellow church folks that you could agree to disagree and worship the other. But evangelicalism has gotten to the point that my mom did not want to put on Facebook that she was supporting Hillary Clinton because it would have been a problem. Because she would have felt like she had to leave certain circles or sacrifice certain relationships. And I think for the 19% of evangelicals, white evangelicals who didn't vote for Trump, that's the question they're all asking is do we have to leave? Is there still a home for us? And so those boundaries are changing and they're being redefined over politics in ways that they weren't in previous generations, I don't think.
So I have a question. So did Black evangelicals vote in the same way that the whites did?
No, and that was the fun thing in my apocalypse book, was they would start with the same theology, and then there's the social application of that theology would be almost opposite, 180 degrees different from white. So in the New Deal, they loved all of Roosevelt's social programs. The white evangelicals were denouncing Social Security as a big socialist takeover. African Americans loved the United Nations because they hoped that it would help bring some racial justice in the U.S. and also support decolonization movements. White evangelicals hated the United Nations. And so historically, we can see that the theology is not theology separate from social context, that people read their theology through their racial identities, and again, same with gender and sexuality. But with Trump, it certainly, the 2016 election, African Americans and Latinos voted much more for Hillary Clinton than they did for Donald Trump. What's surprising is that Trump picked up some of those folks in 2020. And the question now with and journalists and sociologists are why. And they think it may be over abortion in the courts,
Right.
that they supported Trump's social policies and were willing to kind of overlook some of his other stuff for that.
Carmen, I have a question from John Streamus for you. What can we do for people whose identities are forced upon them, e.g. prisoners, slaves, refugees?
I would argue that those are not identities. I would argue that those are labels that are imposed on people. Of course, that there are ways in which people can adopt labels that are imposed on them. But at the end of the day, I don't see those as identities at all. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know if he has a
I
follow-up.
was just gonna say, yes, no one can see you in Google.
Oh. Then I want to look for. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Alejandro.
It's obvious that, for example, when you're in your lecture or in your talk, you talk about the idea of identity and claiming identity as something of regarding power also, because it's obvious that if you have power, if you have a certain position of privilege, you can choose to claim that kind of privilege, that kind of identities. And for example, something that is very interesting is that you start talking about, for example, you talk about a specific period that it's 9/11, and after 9/11, a lot of people start to claim labels and identities towards certain situations. And then you put it into another historical period that perhaps is right now talking about the Trump election and a lot of these cases of identities. Do you think that right now, due to this post-Trump era, it's more these claiming identities from certain situation of privilege, like people from privilege trying to claiming this kind of strange situation, these false identities, if we can call like that.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking about when you're talking?
Yeah, for example, I'm thinking right now, for example, in the case of CK, it is obvious that when he is starting to talk like this, he is impulsed in a certain way because of the political situation also, the sociocultural situation, because if he lives still in a kind of a, not conservative, but a more liberal situation in which he cannot say like that, he cannot say that kind of things, he will never gonna start to put labels or claim identities. And the same goes, for example, in the case of the professor that we all know that claimed her identity, her African-American identity. She wouldn't do that if the sociopolitical arena wouldn't allow her in a certain way, if there was not. So could it be possible that in this historical situation, in this Trump, post-Trump era, is that opening more than those cases, or is something like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're asking whether the climate and the whatever that was created with the Trump administration created a situation in which it's easier for certain folks to claim or not claim identities. In the case of Louis C.K., I think that, we can go back to the issue of things that are marked on the body, right? Because in going back to your point about privilege, the thing about him is that he doesn't look like anything that people would imagine when they imagine the category Mexican, right? So he really, he doesn't. And in fact, I don't think if he'd never said, right, that his dad was Mexican, nobody would have even thought of that, right, as a possibility for him, for his background. In the case of the former professor, it's funny that we all can talk about her, right, and everybody knows who we're talking about without saying her name once. In the case of the former professor, I don't think that it's easier for people to claim an identity like that, specifically that identity. But I think that had she done that at the beginning of the century, let's say in 2001, as opposed to when it happened, I think it would have been more difficult for her. She would have had less support than she did this time. But yeah, I don't know. Let me continue thinking about that.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, just in terms of choosing identities for power, Alejandro, if that's kind of what you're getting at. The other interesting thing that's happened since 2016 with evangelicals is the numbers of people going to evangelical churches are shrinking, but the number of people who identify as evangelicals, this just came out in the last 4 or 5 weeks, has grown dramatically. And so as evangelicals perceive themselves as having access to political power, more and more people are claiming to be evangelical who don't ever step foot in an evangelical church. And so there's also this larger question now of what is an evangelical, somebody who goes to an evangelical church, or is it somebody who just votes on Republican social policy and pro-gun, pro-God, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights? So, but it is becoming, a label that you would not have used for power or privilege in the 60s is now a label that you can use for power and privilege.
That's an interesting way of, looking at it. The going to church versus the voting was, the determining feature. Yeah, Shannon.
I found both talks very informative, but I was also intrigued in some ways. Let me first ask, it's also a comment, and as well as a question. That I was really intrigued by your examples of dinosaurs. I was indeed enlightened as well as puzzling. But for me, it seems to bring in a question that is, when we talk about, when we define or critique identity politics in this age, because these two seem to point to climate change or the kind of impact that the atmospherical, the terrestrial can change. And so I was wondering, well, let me explain a little bit. Dinosaur, of course, the Cretaceous age ended with total sort of annihilation of the ecosystem. And now it relates to or resonates to Martians, because some would argue that the reason we are interested in finding other habitable planets is because we know we screwed up with this one and we're leaving. I think a lot of people believe in that. So in what ways, I was thinking, I was really enlightened by the many aspects you point out, genealogy, relational, historical, as well as, but it seems to me that there's always this, I wouldn't call it meta identity, but there is this oversight we have all been guilty of, that our corporeal, our ethnic, and as well as relational, communal being has a lot to do with the places we grew up with, or the places we want to settle for. There is a lot of argument about settler colonialism. So, yeah, so how would you respond to that by using these two examples?
I don't think I would. To be honest, when I began writing that I didn't have Martians and dinosaurs as my first, I actually had mermaids and indigenous, you know. But the problem that as I kept writing, I was thinking, you know, there are actually people who identify as mermaids. And there are indigenous folks all over the world. So I really didn't want to confuse things, and I didn't want to make it difficult for people to follow, to get hung up on something. So I just picked, you know, those two because I've never heard anyone identify, except for like 4-year-olds, right, who say I'm a dinosaur or I'm a Martian, or but you know, they kind of grow out of it at some point, for the most part. So the connecting the body, I mean, connecting the body to where we are, connecting the body to our historical moment that, you know, that has to do with a really screwed up situation climatically, right, for the planet, and all that. I think that, yeah, there is something about our identities as they are and as they operate today that influences all that. And I think, I mean, Matt kind of touched on that when he was talking about evangelical identity and, you know, ideas about climate change, or ideas about, you know, how all this is operating. But I think that who we are, who we think we are, right, which is what identities are, does matter in terms of this hell of a mess we're in. Absolutely. But I don't think that dinosaurs are Martians, really.
Could you repeat the last thing you said? Did you say who we think we are does not matter? Is that what you said? Or did I?
It does matter.
It does matter.
It does matter.
Regardless of the societal labeling and all that. But there was kind of my question too. How do you, how do you teach that to the students? I mean, right, it's easy to say, well, we need to learn to affirm our identity and who we think we are, but then we are constantly faced with the societal. There is a perception that may not have anything to do with our sense of who we are. So it requires a kind of ongoing negotiation, right? So I mean, like affirming one's identity, like as a Martian or a Gainas, whatever. I mean, it's a one thing, but how do you teach your students to negotiate that with the societal perception, or what Franz Fanon calls the collective unconscious? Collective unconscious it's a really hard to beat. Why collective unconscious? Collective unconscious period has this like a kind of almost like a biological prejudice against the Black people, according to Franz Fanon, Fanon being Franz Fanon. And as a Black person, if you're a Black person or Asian, you can claim, you can affirm, you can assert your identity however much you want, but there is this collective unconscious that completely defeats. So there is like a self-hatred within the Black person. So it's a collective unconscious that has taught him or her to hate himself or herself. So it's a very incredibly complex and difficult question.
Yeah, well, you should sit in my 101 class or my 201 class. Because that's actually a semester's worth of, of teaching. But what I will say is that there is a way to teach about race and to teach about racism and to teach about hatred that disentangles the individual from the system long enough for them to understand what's going on, right? And I tell them, you're implicated there, you're part of that. But for now, I just need you to detach yourself for 1 second and just look at it and tell me everything that you see, right, from what I'm showing you. And what becomes evident usually when I do that, and like I said, I mean, that's throughout the course of a whole semester, is that students will do that. They will detach themselves and they will look at it, but they will always look at it from a particular angle and from a particular lens. And that lens is informed by who they think they are. So yeah, it's difficult, but it is important for students to understand that, yeah, these are social phenomena. Yes, sure. And they affect individuals, of course, but at the same time, they need to understand how they operate and how they are placed within that dynamic and within that system. Matt, would you?
No, I just wish more of my students were in your class.
I just want to add, I mean, I like the Kinsuk's question too, but it seems like you're still going back, even though you're asking students to disentangle, you're actually asking them to disentangle themselves for a moment so they can just see how entangled they are actually in the whole process and the whole colonial sort of history.
Yeah.
So I kind of liked your, using the whole idea of how do we choose that identity, given that do I start from Latinx? I start from recognizing my coloniality because I'm Latinx in Puerto Rico. And I'd ask Matt the same thing about evangelicals. I felt at the end, you say religion matters less. Is it that matters less, or do we begin to recognize the extent to which religion is imbricated, in that way? It's really entangled and messy and in ways that we hadn't thought of before. We thought we could actually separate it over here. Like you mentioned about in the 60s and the early periods when we didn't seem to have that kind of, politicking going on. But was that really the case, or were we always entangled, particularly when we think of missions and that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That it isn't that religion matters less. It's that we can't understand religion apart from race and class and gender.
Right.
In that, I guess the more honest answer for me is that I think I was doing better than the previous generation at taking these things seriously. But what Trump taught me is that I wasn't doing it seriously enough, and that moving forward, it's even more messy and entangled than I had realized.
Yeah.
So I have a question from Joshua Bonzo.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see the demarcation line shifting with time? Historically, there were only two biological genders. We now see some cultures of the world that recognize an official third gender. Do you see the view of identity from within as being powerful enough to change the external view long-term to the point where we can have people identifying as what they biologically cannot be, e.g. non-toddlers indicating they actually are dinosaurs, hyperbole intended?
Yeah, well, I want, speaking of disentangling, I want to disentangle two things there in that question. So one is the issue of biology. Biology is a science, and science is a pretty recent phenomenon. So cultures throughout the history, oh my, I'm talking like my students now. Throughout time and the history of humanity, different cultures have acknowledged not only a third sex, but a fourth sex and whatever. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if we are using biology, I mean, biologically, there are more than two sexes that science has turned into two and has, especially Western science, has put these, or has created these two sexes that everybody who's born is put into. But, you know, there's the XO children that are born, and they've been born forever, and those children are usually categorized as women. Should they be categorized as women? Well, there's all sorts of things in studies on them, and you know, what happens to them. There's also intersex children who, again, are changed by science, by medicine, when they're very little, when they're born. And so what we've done is we have created those two categories. Biology just, you know, comes up with all sorts of things. But the question about what a person identifies, you know, in terms of their gender is a completely different thing. That, you know, it's performed by us every day, and it is sometimes connected to biological sex, but sometimes it isn't.
Carmen, if I may clarify, I should have written a little bit better my question. The point with the gender is actually just an example. My real question actually stemmed from you saying that there are actually people that identify as mermaids, which I did not know. So the real question is simply this: if enough people begin to identify as something that they physically cannot be, like, unless a human being actually becomes able to, you know, grow fins and breathe water. The question I'm asking here is, will enough people over time eventually recognize that? Because enough people identify themselves in this way. So the gender issue really wasn't my issue, and I apologize for wording that poorly. That was just as an example. More so the idea of if people actually are already identifying themselves as things that realistically they could not be, could they eventually, would society allow that? That's, I guess, my question.
Well, I guess one answer is why couldn't they be? And, you know, it's not about growing gills or breathing underwater. It's about, in the case of the mermaids, I haven't studied the mermaids. I don't, you know, I'm just going by what I've seen and what I've read. But in their case, you know, these are usually women I don't think I've seen any cases of men. But women who just are in the water with, some kind of stuff in their feet and their legs that makes them look like mermaids. Are they mermaids? I don't know. Should they claim to be? Why not? Are they harming anybody? Are they right? And that's some of the questions that I raised. It's like, what's the purpose of doing any of that? But to answer your question directly, I don't know. Let's try it. Let's try all identifying as Martians and see if the category gets recognized by somebody somewhere. Or let's add to the mermaids, although I'm not all that fond of being in the water for too long. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question for Matt. So where do you think the evangelicals are going? Is there something that's gonna maybe rein them in or tone them down, such as the bankruptcy of the NRA, or what should we expect?
Yeah, it's hard to predict. When Jerry Falwell disbanded the Moral Majority in 1987, everybody thought the religious right was dead, and then came back on Christian Coalition in the 90s. And then, George W. Bush was kind of their savior, and then Barack Obama was elected. Everybody thought they were dead, and then Trump. So every time they get counted out, they come back in a new form. For those of us who don't support their politics, because I don't want to presume that none of them do, but the younger evangelicals tend to be more progressive, more moderate, very much so on race and gender and sexuality issues. So I think there is hope that the kind of current folks, the kind of Trump-affiliated folks, that within a generation are going to be gone, and it's going to look very different. But like I said, we've thought that before and been wrong, so we'll see.
So what is the current statistics? Americans who identify themselves as evangelical.
It's about a quarter. It's pretty substantial. About a quarter, 25%, between 22 to 25%, of Americans self-identify as evangelical.
And how about percentage of Christians?
So Americans who identify as Christians is about 70%, and then the difference of Americans who identify as Christians but not evangelicals. I don't remember, because Catholics, Mormons are obviously the biggest, and then the historically Black churches are kind of the three biggest non-evangelical groups.
Okay.
Pew Research Center has all this data.
Any other questions from over there?
No.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Yeah. I have to turn this into a paper at some point, so. And thank you everyone online as well.